Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a conflict that, well, it really convulsed West German intellectual life 4 decades ago.
Oh, absolutely.
But its shadow, that still falls so heavily across modern political culture. We're talking about the Historikerstreit.
The historians' debate of 1986.
And this was not some polite academic disagreement, was it?
Not at all. As our sources show, this was an existential crisis. A whole nation grappling with the memory of, well, the greatest catastrophe in its history. It was an extraordinary moment.
It really was.
You had historians and philosophers stepping out of the academy. I mean, right onto the front pages of the biggest newspapers.
In your Spiegel, the FAZ.
Exactly. Forcing the entire Federal Republic to confront this question of how they define their national identity in the shadow of Auschwitz. And our sources for this deep dive are the core documents of that very conflict. The original articles, the rebuttals, the accusations.
And we're talking about some very prominent figures.
Central figures. People like Ernst Nolte, Jürgen Habermas, Andreas Hillgruber, and Joachim Fest.
So our mission today is, I suppose, straightforward but also profoundly complex. We want to extract the core intellectual and political arguments, specifically the arguments around the historical place and, crucially, the uniqueness or singularity of the Nazi crimes.
That's the key word, singularity.
Yeah. We want to know how a nation, 40 years after a catastrophe like that, decides how it should remember its darkest past.
And how to do that without the past either, suffocating its future or, on the other hand, being carelessly discarded.
It's a fine line to walk.
It is. And what's immediately fascinating here is just the sheer weight of memory that the sources describe. The historical fact of the Third Reich is not a chapter you can just file away.
Yeah.
It's described as an unforgettable negative judgment, and in Germany, this collective memory is framed as nothing less than a necessity of life for the surviving nation.
A necessity of life. That's powerful.
It is, and this necessity, it dictates the political and moral boundaries of the debate right from the very start.
Which brings us to this inherent structural problem that the historians themselves were articulating.
Right.
When a historical phenomenon maintains what they call a permanent negative or positive vitality.
When it stays intensely relevant.
Exactly. It risks transforming into a myth. And in Germany's case, a permanent negative myth, this sort of moral anchor that dictates all subsequent political thought. Well, it risks inhibiting genuine, critical historical inquiry.
And that was the charge. The revisionists in 1986, they argued that this very mythic status was actively endangering the objectivity of their science.
So to understand that volcanic eruption in 1986, we have to go back.
We do. We have to establish the trajectory of how Germany initially dealt with its past right after the collapse of the Third Reich. The negative verdict immediately after World War II wasn't just moral condemnation.
It was inescapable reality.
It was inescapable physical and political reality. The nation was occupied, it was carved up, there was no avoiding it.
And the sources, they outline these initial interpretations, what they refer to as the Great Accusation.
That's right. And this first wave of post-war guilt literature, it was highly focused. It was directed mostly at specific traditional classes, not the entire German population.
Which was politically useful, right, for both East and West.
Precisely. On one hand, you see this intense focus on the Junker.
The Prussian landowning aristocracy, the military elite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were blamed for the German Sonderweg, this idea of a separate German path that supposedly deviated from the peaceful, democratic development of Western Europe.
So by blaming this militaristic Prussian elite, the focus of the guilt could be, what, externalized?
It could be. Away from the wider urban bourgeoisie or the working classes. And on the other hand, the sources highlight the economic magnates.
The capitalists and industrialists, people like Flick and Krupp.
They were targeted as key promoters, financiers, even foster fathers of the Nazi Party. And this narrative was particularly convenient for the emerging political left and, of course, for East Germany.
The GDR.
Yes, the GDR, which officially framed Nazism as the inevitable product of late capitalism. It fit their ideology perfectly.
And we have to remember, this focus, it wasn't just literary or academic. It actually drove policy.
It absolutely did. I mean, a tangible representation of this blame came when the four occupying powers formally dissolved the state of Prussia entirely in 1947.
They just wiped it off the map.
Citing its history as a source of militarism. And beyond that, the Nuremberg trials weren't just about the main political criminals. They extended very clearly to the diplomats and to those powerful industrialists which really cemented that narrative of corporate and class guilt.
And that initial focus, by pinpointing the Junker and the capitalists, it allowed the average German citizen to feel, what? A degree of relief.
Or at least a manageable sense of collective guilt. It allowed them to say, the problem was rooted in their traditions, not mine.
But even then, right after the war, there were cracks forming.
Subtle intellectual cracks, yes. It indicates that this historiographical debate was always sort of simmering under the surface. The sources mention early counter-literature. Well, people like Gerhard Ritter, who argued for a more nuanced understanding of Prussianism, or Louis P. Lochner defending the industrialists.
But these were seen as just minor corrections at the time.
Exactly. Not a fundamental challenge to the overall negative image of the war and the crimes. The consensus on the inherent evil of the Nazi state remained, absolute.
Then the Cold War intensifies, and the totalitarianism concept emerges.
This was a critical shift.
Aye.
Because it was an overt attempt to broaden the negativity, to simultaneously integrate the former Soviet ally into that same negative framework.
It was an intellectual alignment with NATO and the West.
It was. The totalitarianism literature, with prominent thinkers like Hannah Arendt and Carl Friedrich, it focused on drawing these structural comparisons.
Between the Third Reich and the Stalinist USSR.
Right. They compared the single-party state, the all-encompassing ideology, the secret police, the terror mechanisms.
The pervasive fear.
And that structural comparison is absolutely vital for understanding the 1986 debate.
Because it laid the groundwork.
It provided the intellectual scaffolding for the later revisionists. By linking the Third Reich to Soviet terror, the door was suddenly open for those in the 1980s who wanted to equate the systems more explicitly.
To make the Nazi past seem less exceptional?
Exactly. By bundling it with Soviet terror, they could ask, if they're both totalitarian, why must we, the Germans, bear a uniquely heavy moral burden?
But the path wasn't straight, was it?
Yeah.
See, 60s and 70s saw a shift.
Right. The totalitarianism concept was weakened for a bit. The Vietnam War era briefly strengthened neo-Marxist views, especially those from the Frankfurt School, which put the blame squarely back on the capitalist system.
And that weakened the dual anti-communist framework of the totalitarianism model.
It did. But by the late 1970s, the intellectual landscape shifted dramatically again, forcing new questions upon German historians. And this shift, it wasn't just internal.
It was driven by global events.
Dramatic global events. The sources detailed the visible fragility of Western imperialism.
The U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, for example.
That, the relentless military buildup of the Soviet Union, and, crucially, new undeniable examples of non-Western mass violence emerge.
You're talking about Cambodia, Pol Pot.
The brutal conflicts in Cambodia under Pol Pot, the millions killed, the mass flight described as a Holocaust on the water from Southeast Asia.
And the Iranian Revolution.
Yes, all of this happening on the world stage.
So what's the link there? Why did atrocities in Cambodia create pressure for German historical revision?
Because it forced German historians to contextualize the Third Reich within broader universal patterns of 20th century mass violence and geopolitical pressure. It raised a question for the conservative establishment, especially under Helmut Kohl.
The question being,
if genocide and mass murder are not uniquely German, but rather a characteristic horror of the entire 20th century, does this demand a comprehensive revision of the German historical narrative?
does the German trauma just become one trauma among many?
Exactly.
Huh.
And this brings us to the definition of revision itself, which is where the debate gets so fraught.
In the academic sense, the sources are clear. Revision is not political cover-up.
No, it's defined as a fundamental, constant, self-renewing criticism of prevailing assumptions. It's characterized as essential for Western science, the continuous critique of established truths.
The sources even provide an analogy,
They do. They use the example of American Civil War historiography.
which was initially written only by the victors.
Right. And it was only much later that a greater understanding of the motives and the social conditions of the defeated South emerged. Revision, in that purely academic sense, is just critical inquiry. It's necessary to refine historical truth.
But the danger, as we started with, is that the negative vitality of a phenomenon like Nazism transforms it into a myth. And if that negative myth is unassailable, if the memory of the Holocaust is permanently outside the realm of academic comparison.
Then it endangers science by inhibiting genuine critical inquiry.
And this was the core criticism the revisionists leveled against the existing critical history establishment in 1986.
It was. They claimed the moral pressure to treat the Nazi past as singular was preventing them from asking essential questions about its origins and its connections to other European traumas.
They were, in essence, arguing that history shouldn't be treated as some kind of moral safeguard for the state.
Exactly. If history's primary function is to serve as an unforgettable negative judgment, then the historian ceases to be a scientist.
And becomes a moral prosecutor.
A moral prosecutor. And that's where the conflict became deeply political.
Okay, so now we move into the arguments that truly detonated the debate. We have to start with Ernst Nolte.
We do. A historian of fascism. And his deeply provocative causal thesis, which immediately sought to contextualize the Nazi crimes by looking east.
Nolte's core contention was structured as a question, right? A philosophical provocation.
It was a question of sequence and cause. Was the archipel Gulag
Stalinist class extermination.
the logical and factual Prius of Auschwitz?
Nazi race extermination.
That was the question.
Okay, let's pause on that term Prius. We should translate it as more than just precursor.
It's stronger than that. It means the logically and factually necessary precondition.
So Nolte was asking, did the Soviet terror have to exist intellectually and chronologically for the Nazi terror to follow?
That's it. Precisely. Nolte explicitly asked if the Nazis committed what he called an Asiatic deed, because they perceived themselves as potential victims of a prior Asiatic deed.
Which fundamentally reframes the Nazi crimes.
Completely. It's not a unique German invention anymore. It's a reactive measure born out of a genuine, profound fear of Bolshevism, which he argued was already practicing extermination.
That immediately changes the moral topography, doesn't it?
It does.
It shifts the Third Reich from being the ultimate originator of 20th century mass violence to being a horrified, if monstrously effective, imitator.
And that was the political and academic power of his argument. Nolte argued that Hitler, through his own interpretation, which Nolte admitted could be skewed or exaggerated, he saw the Bolshevik actions, the mass killing of class enemies, the terror of 1936-38, the forced starvation. He saw all that as a prior threat.
And that perception, for Nolte, was the deepest root for Hitler's own extremism.
Especially his specific form of anti-Bolshevik, anti-Semitic terror. The sources mention that Nolte explicitly drew on existing, widely circulated literature from the early 1920s.
Stuff that described mass deportations, executions, torture, death camps in Bolshevik Russia.
Yes. He points out that the sole exception in the Russian methods was the highly organized technical process of gassing.
And to give that fear a visceral reality for his readers, the sources point to a specific chilling detail Nolte used.
The rat cage torture.
Yes, to illustrate this genuine sense of unprecedented terror that was common among contemporaries around 1920.
He mentions reports of early Cheka prisons and this gruesome rat cage torture, a brutal, personalized form of execution. And even if it was exaggerated in the initial anti-Bolshevik propaganda, Nolte believed this imagery contributed to Hitler's foundational terror complex.
But wait, if we accept Nolte's premise that Hitler saw the Gulag as the Prius, doesn't that fundamentally ignore decades, even centuries, of homegrown German anti-Semitism that predated the Bolshevik Revolution?
And the critics absolutely jumped on this.
I would imagine so.
It highlights the risk of Nolte's method. While his argument provided a specific chronological causal framework, the critics immediately countered that it provided an apologetic framework.
Because causality could be seen as an excuse.
Nolte's causality, that because the Gulag was historically prior to Auschwitz, the connection couldn't be ignored, was seen as a form of intellectual evasion. It tried to make the crime reactive rather than proactive.
And Nolte deepened the controversy significantly.
He did, with his highly scrutinized use of that 1939 statement by Chaim Weizmann,
Who was then head of the Jewish Agency.
and he asserted that Jews worldwide would fight on England's side.
And this point was exceptionally volatile.
Extremely. Nolte used the statement, which he found in an official chronology, to infer that this declaration authorized Hitler, in some twisted legal or military sense, to treat German Jews as prisoners of war and intern them.
He was looking for a document, any rationale.
Any rationale that might explain the speed and totality of the subsequent Nazi actions.
But the critique here was devastating, wasn't it? And multi-layered.
It was. Jürgen Habermas and Rudolf Augstein immediately noted that this assumption treating world Jewry as a singular international legal subject capable of declaring war was indistinguishable from classic anti-Semitic projections of a global conspiracy.
It was granting Hitler's paranoid worldview historical legitimacy.
That was the charge. And furthermore, there was a glaring legal and logical flaw, which was pointed out forcefully.
Which was?
Even if you accepted the ridiculous notion that the entire global Jewish population were belligerents, existing international law, specifically the Hague Conventions, forbade reprisals against non-combatants.
Women, the elderly, children.
Exactly. So Nolte's attempt to find a pseudo-legal or historical authorization was widely seen as the height of apologetic revisionism.
It effectively implied the victims somehow brought their internment.
And by extension, their subsequent destruction upon themselves?
That was the implication that horrified his critics.
So moving on from Nolte to the second key revisionist, Andreas Hillgruber. A different approach, but equally controversial.
Yes. His book Zweierlei Untergang, or Two Kinds of Downfall. The controversy started with its very structure.
He juxtaposed the smashing of the German Reich, focusing on the Eastern Front in 44 and 45, with the end of European Jewry.
And that structural juxtaposition was the immediate source of the attack.
Why?
Critics argued that by devoting equal space to these two events, and by using a neutral term like end for the Holocaust, while presenting the military struggle of the Germans as a national tragedy, Ausschlagung.
He was being apologetic.
They argued he was inherently apologetic, subtly downplaying the moral magnitude of the Holocaust by equating it with German national suffering. But Hillgruber's declared intent was different, wasn't it? He was concerned with perspective.
Explicitly. He wanted to view the 1944-45 situation from the perspective of the German soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front.
The ones defending German civilian populations against what they anticipated would be the Red Army's orgy of revenge.
And the sources emphasized that atrocities like those at Nemmersdorf were already known. This was driving a genuine fear among the German population.
And this is the core of the ethical conflict Hillgruber articulated.
It is, and it requires us to slow down and understand the two ethical concepts he forced into collision. Verantwortungsethik versus Gesinnungsethik.
Okay, let's clarify these for everyone. Hillgruber focused on Verantwortungsethik.
Responsibility ethics. The idea that your actions must be judged by their practical, foreseeable consequences.
So in this context, the frontline commander's duty was local and immediate. Protect the civilians streaming west.
Precisely. The holding of the front by the Austere, the army in the east, prevented immense immediate suffering for Eastern German civilians. But, and here's a dilemma,
that very act of resistance prolonged the existence of the Nazi regime.
And ensured the extermination machines like Auschwitz could continue operating behind the lines. Auschwitz kept running until November 1944.
So the soldiers' necessary bravery in protecting local civilians tragically contributed to a crime of unimaginable global scope.
An impossible situation. And this starkly contrasts with Gesinnungsethik,
Conviction ethics.
which Hillgruber implied was the position of the July 20th resistance plotters.
The ones who tried to assassinate Hitler.
They were driven by conviction, the need to signal a different Germany by overthrowing Hitler, even though they knew their actions risked causing the front to collapse.
Exposing the German civilian population to the Red Army sooner.
Yes. So Hillgruber, by focusing on the soldiers' immediate consequential duty, their responsibility ethics, risked providing a political justification for the continuation of the war, regardless of the regime's ultimate criminality.
The critics argued this is a false choice. That the historical situation of being confined to choose between the arch-evils of the century, between Hitler and Stalin, was itself the ultimate tragedy of Germany. But Hillgruber seemed to validate the choice to fight on behalf of the regime.
And that tension became a flashpoint. Hillgruber was trying to insert historical empathy for the victims of the Red Army advance, but in doing so, he appeared to shift moral empathy away from the victims of the Nazi regime.
He tried to contextualize the German tragedy.
But his critics argued that tragedy could not be equated with the planned, industrialized murder of the Jewish people.
Which brings us to our third key revisionist figure, Michael Sturmer, who shifted the debate again.
Away from military or causal history towards the overtly political role of history itself in contemporary society.
Sturmer was deeply concerned about West Germany becoming a Geschichtsloses Land.
A country without history, rootless in its past.
And his thesis was aggressively political. It was aimed directly at the Kohl government's need for national cohesion in the 1980s.
Absolutely. He argued that in a rootless society, the person who fills the memory, shapes the concepts, and interprets the past, wins the future.
So history must serve a political purpose. This idea of Sinnstiftung.
Giving meaning.
Right. Therefore, politically responsible history must help build national consensus, moving beyond this perpetual self-reproach to forge a coherent, positive national identity.
And Sturmer and other historians of his cohort, like Hagen Schulze, they actively revived the Mittellage thesis.
The middle position thesis.
The suggestion that Germany's perpetual geographical situation in the heart of Europe inevitably led to instability and conflict. They implied that historical forces, specifically geographical pressure, often dictated Germany's political trajectory.
What were the domestic political implications of reviving that thesis in the 1980s?
Well, it was a critique of West Germany's liberal post-war democracy. Sturmer suggested that historical instability implied that Bismarck's authoritarian pre-parliamentary structure might have been necessary to keep the internal dynamics of the Reich restrained and maintain European peace.
That is a huge claim. A direct defense of pre-democratic German traditions.
It is. The political application of this view serves to critique early democratization efforts and push back against West Germany's liberal political culture. It suggests Germany needed a stronger, nationally conscious identity to fulfill its global responsibilities.
Which, in 1986, meant what?
Serving as the key middle piece in the European defense arch of the Atlantic system against the Soviet threat.
So they argued that only a commitment to a broader German history, beyond the Nazi period,
1,000 years of history, not just the 12 years of shame,
could achieve the kind of national cohesion necessary for Germany to be a reliable, politically self-assured partner in the Western Alliance.
History was explicitly treated as a tool for political stability and normalization.
And this expansionist, normalizing view of history was where the critics, led by Jürgen Habermas, truly pushed back.
This is where the battle lines were drawn.
They insisted that this revisionist project risked flattening the unique moral dimension of the Holocaust. Their core argument was that the Nazi crimes retain a qualitative singularity.
A singularity that comparison with the Gulag or Pol Pot risks obscuring. And that qualitative distinction hinges centrally on the ideological basis of extermination.
The difference between race and class.
This is essential for understanding the German moral landscape. The critics acknowledged that the Cheka in 1918 declared its goal was to exterminate the bourgeoisie as a class.
Without regard for individual guilt.
Right, it was social extermination. There's a famous quote from Cheka officer Martin Latsis: "The first thing you have to ask an arrested person is, to which class does he belong?" The victim was an enemy of the state because of their social status.
Conversely, the Nazi crimes were based purely on
What?
biological extermination.
Racial belonging, arbitrarily defined. They targeted the Jewish people, who weren't inherently hostile to the German people or the German state. In fact, many were highly assimilated.
So the decision was based solely on whether an entire other people was allowed to exist on Earth.
Regardless of action or affiliation, the victims, as one witness said, went to their deaths like clockwork puppets.
So even though mass murder is still mass murder, the critics argued there remains a crucial qualitative difference.
A huge difference. The bureaucratic, systematic, passionless, perfect murder machine of the industrialized Third Reich.
Contrasted sharply with what they saw in the Stalinist state.
Right. The chaotic mix of civil war excesses, execution, forced labor, and starvation, often seen in the more politically primitive Stalinist state. The critics saw the Nazi crime as a crime against the very concept of humanity.
A total negation of the victim's right to exist.
Detached from any political or social utility, it was an end in itself, the perfect, total administrative destruction.
And this leads directly into that fascinating debate over technique, the administration of murder.
And whether the gas chamber was just an evolution of the neck shot.
Habermas famously accused Nolte of reducing Auschwitz to the format of a technical innovation.
He was arguing that by focusing on the Gulag as the Prius, Nolte was implying that the Nazi crime was merely a technically superior way of carrying out a previously existing Russian crime.
As if the gas chambers were simply more efficient, but not morally distinct.
Like introducing an assembly line into an industry? That was the charge.
And Joachim Fest, a key revisionist figure and editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, FAZ, he jumped in to defend Nolte on this point.
He did, and he pushed the technical comparison further. He asked if mass liquidations by neck shot, common during the Red Terror, are qualitatively different from gassing.
A provocative question.
Fest argued that while gas chambers are especially repugnant and horrific, the comparable element,
The administrative bureaucratic mass murder.
organized and carried out by the state against an arbitrarily defined group, is stronger and more historically significant than the technical difference.
So for Fest, the common element was 20th century state barbarism, regardless of the apparatus used.
Yes. But the critics held fast to the idea that the technique and its ideological application mattered profoundly. They insisted that the destruction of the Jews was carried out using methods indicated for vermin.
This deliberate dehumanization.
And the bureaucratic focus on efficiency and planning the murder process that made it singularly unprecedented. The critic Eberhard Jekyll, for instance, he stressed that the Nazi decision to murder all Jews, regardless of age, sex, or nationality across Europe, was fundamentally unique.
No other regime had ever conceived of that.
Or systematically attempted to carry out such a universal, biologically motivated genocide. This total, uncompromising finality was the signature of its singularity.
And so the overwhelming rejection from the critics was directed at this idea of Aufrechnung.
Moral reckoning or balancing.
Habermas and others saw these comparisons not as genuine historical research, but as a political strategy.
They viewed it as an attempt to throw off the mortgage of a happily demoralized past.
To seek historical relief by saying the Soviets were worse, or at least they started it.
The critics argued that comparing horrors is a moral hazard, especially when it's done to elevate your own nation's suffering, like Hillgruber's focus on the Eastern Front, while mitigating its unique crime-like Nolte's focus on the Gulag precursor.
It's the crux of the two-quoque argument.
The you did it too argument.
Right. And the critics insisted that the crimes of others do not excuse one's own. To focus solely on comparison risks, acting in an ungeschichtlich way.
An unhistorical way. It ignores the unique historical and moral responsibility Germany inherited. As one source noted, debating whether Hitler or Stalin was more or less acceptable.
It often boiled down to that unacceptable alternative.
And the very act of weighing them seemed to grant a dangerous political absolution. The theologian Walter Euchner captured this sentiment, stating that the attempt to see NS rule in a milder parallel with other regimes remains morally unfruitful for facing one's own responsibility.
So you have the revisionists saying, we must compare to understand.
And the critics responding, you must not compare, because to understand is to normalize. And normalization leads to forgetting the singular nature of the crime.
And the debate quickly spilled out of academia.
Oh, completely. It became a confrontation over the foundational political culture of the Federal Republic itself, a battle between two deeply competing visions of how the state should derive its moral legitimacy and national cohesion.
So on one side, you had the national identity argument.
Put forth most forcefully by Sturmer and Fest.
And they were seeking psychological relief for the post-war generation.
They were. They argued that young Germans have the right to be proud of their country and must step out of Hitler's shadow by connecting to 1,000 years of untainted history beyond Nazism. This was the essence of the Sinnstiftung, the meaning-giving argument. They worried that a nation perpetually focused solely on guilt would lack the confidence and historical grounding necessary to function effectively as a sovereign power in the NATO alliance.
So they wanted to restore national self-regard by validating pre-democratic German traditions.
Like the historical successes of the Bismarckian Reich, which Habermas and the critics feared were inherently nationalist and dangerous.
And this vision was overtly linked to the political establishment of the 1980s.
Absolutely. Sturmer argued that in a society without history, the one who interprets the past wins the future. This history was explicitly meant to serve the government's agenda of normalizing the past and stabilizing a national identity that could fulfill its role as that strategically essential middle piece in the European defense structure.
Then you have Habermas's powerful counter-thesis,
which redefined what patriotism should mean for a post-Auschwitz nation.
Constitutional patriotism, for Fassen's patriotism.
It's a crucial concept. Habermas asserted that the only acceptable form of patriotism for Germany is not one based on shared language or ethnicity or historical land.
But on what?
A binding commitment to universalist constitutional principles, democracy, human rights, rule of law, formed after and through the moral catastrophe of Auschwitz.
His fear was acute then.
Extremely. Linking identity to the whole of German history, especially those pre-democratic traditions favored by Sturmer and Schulze, risked reviving the very nationalist ideologies that created the disaster in the first place. Verfassen's patriotismus was his firewall against that.
So Habermas was essentially saying that Germany's modern political culture, the Federal Republic, is an achievement born of overcoming its past ideologies.
Yes. He said the unconditional opening of the Federal Republic toward the liberal political culture of the West is the great intellectual achievement of our post-war period.
And this achievement must be stabilized by conviction in the Constitution.
Not by seeking old national myths. It's patriotism rooted in values, not blood and soil.
Which brings us back to the historian's method itself and this debate over historization.
Historicization. Hillgruber and Fess argued for this, integrating the Nazi period into the normal flow of history, understanding its causes and contexts, rather than isolating it as a permanent, inexplicable moral anomaly.
They felt this process was necessary for scientific honesty.
They did. Historians like Fest insisted that the moral duty of science required impartiality. They demanded that arguments be examined regardless of the author's motives or political consequences.
Seeking objective history beyond partisan politics.
And they warned vehemently against what they called History der Staatsanwälte und Richter.
The history of prosecutors and judges.
They argued that history moralized to the point of being merely a condemnation destroys the possibility of genuine historical understanding.
But the critics pushed back hard on that.
They did, arguing that the attempt at pure objectivity was itself a political act of evasion when discussing a crime of this magnitude. They highlighted the danger of any historical view that deviated from the prevailing moral consensus being labeled apologetic or complicit with fascism.
For the critics, the sheer scale and nature of the Holocaust meant history could never be value-free.
Especially for Germans. They argued that the demand for objectivity was a shield for political normalization, a way to make the past less burdensome for the present generation.
And the sources document the incredible polarization that happened when these arguments were published in mass media.
The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, FAZ, provided the initial platform, followed by fierce critiques in Die Zeit and Der Spiegel. The debate immediately left the lecture hall.
It became a public spectacle.
A public spectacle. And the public sphere quickly framed the debate as a clear political battle between the critical history establishment, generally leaning left Habermas, Koka,
And the neoconservative revisionists.
Hillgruber, Nolte, Sturmer, who were explicitly seen as trying to stabilize the conservative Kohl government's political agenda and achieve national normalization.
The ferocity of the stakes is just incredible.
It really is. It's exemplified by Rudolf Augstein's response in Der Spiegel. He attacked Hillgruber, calling him a constitutional Nazi for his structural comparison of the Holocaust and the German downfall.
A constitutional Nazi.
And he stated that any teacher who taught such things should be removed from service. That level of personal attack shows you this was about morality, not just methodology.
And the revisionists, in turn, felt intellectually persecuted.
They did. Hillgruber complained that he was attacked despite expressing fundamental abhorrence for the crimes, simply because he attempted to view the crisis from the perspective of the Germans fighting the Red Army.
They felt that any attempt at Historisierung,
putting the Nazi era into context,
was immediately rejected as an attempt to absolve the Germans.
The debate highlighted the conformism that dictated that only one interpretation, the absolute singularity of the crime, was allowed. Any attempt at comparison or contextualization, even in a search for objective causality, risked being branded an apology.
The Historikerstreit forced historians to confront this agonizing decision.
Whether their work should serve a moral function, prevention, remembrance, or a purely scientific one-objective analysis comparison.
And fundamentally, this goes right back to that initial burden we talked about. As one source noted, the historical consciousness of the Germans must always include the awareness of the unprecedented nature of the crimes.
Because otherwise, it remains incomprehensible why the uncomfortable parts of their history, unlike those of other nations, cannot simply be filed away.
The singularity is the necessary moral foundation for the post-war German state.
So what this deep dive really reveals is that the Historikerstreit was far more than, a squabble over footnotes.
Oh, much more. It was a profound, painful challenge to reconcile a nation's continuous historical traditions.
The desire for normalcy and traditional identity as pushed by Sturmer.
With an unprecedented, singular criminal period.
The necessary moral filter demanded by Habermas.
It seems the core question of 1986 remains vital today, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Is Auschwitz a historical anomaly that must prevent all comparisons, remaining singular and unique forever? Or is it a singular peak of terror that must be placed in a larger context of 20th century mass murder?
Alongside the Gulag, Pol Pot, the Armenian genocide,
to be truly understood and therefore potentially prevented in the future.
the sources describe this hope that recognizing and accepting the unprecedented nature of the crimes, the unbegreifliches Grauen, the incomprehensible horror,
That this might paradoxically empower the younger generations.
to ensure that similar societal preconditions for mass atrocity never return. And this requires profound and constant self-critical reflection that accepts the mortgage of the past.
But that path is intellectually fraught. I mean, does genuine historical understanding require the historian to risk being labeled amoral by drawing comparisons and seeking causality, thereby facing the charge of apology?
Or must history always serve a higher moral and political purpose, of verfassungspatriotismus, patriotismus, to prevent recurrence, even if it sacrifices certain lines of pure scientific inquiry?
That tension between scientific honesty and moral responsibility, that was the unbearable weight the historians were struggling under in 1986. And it's one that every modern society grappling with historical trauma must eventually confront.